Bill, you are good to go.
Thanks so much, Alison, and special thanks to Jackie and everyone at the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network. My name is Bill Dempster, CEO of 360 Public Affairs, and do these on a regular basis, always looking for the most important or interesting health policy issue of the day that cancer survivors need to know and learn more about. And hats off to the Survivor Network for hosting these webinars and being interested in actually putting them on and getting some interesting input. The webinars really rely on the folks who are dialing in right now, and we see attendees and the registrants for this one in particular have been very strong. So really looking to you, the listenership, to put questions forward. There's a dialogue box on the top right. This next hour or so, we're going to explore the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer, which is right now in the middle of a very proactive online and consultation, as well as holding its own outreach initiatives. We're very hopeful that this webinar and the panelists' contributions and some of your questions can be considered by CPAC, the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer, as it updates the Canadian Strategy for Cancer Control, and that the listenership is brought up to a new level of understanding of what the organization is, what the strategy is, where it's come from, etc. So we're really fortunate to have several people logging in for serving as panelists today. So I'll just move forward, and as usual, please be in touch if there's any issues with either audio or what you can see. I'd like to introduce today's panel, the first of whom is a dear colleague of ours at 360 Public Affairs. Jerry Jeffcott has 30 years of experience in political, health, and pharmaceutical policy at the national, federal, and provincial levels, and a recognized expert and commentator on market access and reimbursement. For, I think, 5 or 7 years even, right?
5.5 years.
5.5 years, Jerry helped coordinate and support the Industry Oncology Working Group, which actually helped provide the private sector voice on the development of the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review, and through several iterations. Jerry's going to provide some background information on the Canadian Strategy for Cancer Control and the creation of the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer. And he's also going to share with us a brief overview of the ongoing consultations to refresh that strategy. That high-level overview is going to be supplemented by our next panelist. We're going to hear from Jo Kennelly, whom I got to know, it would be over a decade ago when she was in Ottawa. Dr. Jo Kennelly was involved in the development of CPAC. Jo is a health and I almost said a Canadian health and policy expert, Jo, but I think you're a Canadian and New Zealand health and policy expert, currently a leader in the emerging field of artificial intelligence in your role as VP of Strategy at Sightline Innovation. So we'll maybe hear a little bit more about that new role later, especially how AI and data can help drive and inform the next iteration of the strategy. Barry Stein, many of you on the line will know Barry, will also be joining us. He's president and CEO of Colorectal Cancer Canada. I studied Stein versus Quebec back in the day. He's a well-known patient advocate because starting with his own cancer journey, he's done more than many in Canada to ensure that cancer care is improved for Canadians, and he's an advocate, a lawyer, and a true leader of a very important patient group and a friend of the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network. So I think Barry's just having some issues logging in, so we haven't heard him click through yet. But by the time we get to his portion, I'm sure he'll be on the line, or at least I hope he will. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jerry to walk us through the first part of the seminar. Go ahead.
Thanks, Bill. So just to give you a little bit of a backgrounder so that the subsequent conversation can be more useful to you, wanted to give a bit of a rundown on where CPAC came from. It is a federally funded, not-for-profit corporation that's arm's length from government, but it's completely funded through a partnership agreement with the federal government. It was initially created in 2007 under the Harper government, and it has been operating on subsequent 5-year plans since. So they're just now starting their third 5-year plan for 2017-18, and that's really been what's driven this push now to revitalize, rethink about where it's at. Any case, the role of the partnership is really to be a steward of the Canadian National Cancer Control Strategy, or the Canadian Strategy for Cancer Control, CSCC. And it does that in coordination, not just with other governments, but also with a broad range of stakeholders in the cancer community. It has a sort of a comprehensive approach to cancer care, running from prevention, screening, diagnosis, treatment, the whole range of the cancer journey, as well as research and data collection and analysis that are designed to assist it in moving the strategy forward. Currently, it is receiving $47.5 million a year for its to support the partnership, and that's essentially been consistent, within a few $1 million every year since it was established in 2007. And despite the changing government in 2015, the Trudeau administration has endorsed the continuation in its March 2016 budget, and which has allowed us to get to the point now where we're in the third 5-year plan. Just wanted to a little bit of background on an initiative that was started by the current Minister of Health federally to have a look at all of the various health-related organizations that have been created and supported by the federal government. She conducted an external review, or contracted an external review of what are referred to as pan-Canadian health organizations. That includes, in addition to CPAC and the Canadian Mental Health Commission, it also includes things like CADTH, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, the Canadian Institute for Health Information, Canadian Foundation for Health Innovation, etc. A wide variety of groups that the federal government supports. So the external review was conducted last year by PG Forest and by Daniel Martin, Dr. Daniel Martin. They produced a report that essentially said, it's time to look at sort of trying to make some of these organizations a little bit more efficient. Maybe think about merging some within the context of CPAC. The recommendation was essentially to consider whether or not the federal government should continue to have standalone therapeutically oriented strategies, and there was some suggestion of trying to sort of create some efficiencies. That report was presented to the minister. The minister has subsequently contracted an implementation group chaired by Leslie Thompson from Accreditation Canada, a couple of other experts who are on that, and they are in the process of rooting through the external review committee's report and figuring out what to recommend to the minister in terms of a way forward. In any case, I don't perceive that as a sort of a threat to CPAC and its mandate, just maybe reformatted somewhat. But we'll see. That implementation committee's report is due in spring of 2019.
Jerry, just before you go on, the gist of that report was to recommend the merger or the integration of the partnership into the Canadian Agency, or sorry, the Canadian Association of Provincial Cancer Agencies. So just
CAPCA.
CAPCA.
Right.
I just wanted to reframe that and make sure people know what the acronym SOUP is.
Okay. Trying to move my slides across here. Okay. Oops. So as I stated earlier, the CPAC's sort of primary role was to act as steward for the Canadian Strategy for Cancer Control. The strategy had actually predated the partnership by several years. It was really a cancer community developed plan that was started in 1999, and it spent about 6 or 7 years looking at the whole range of the cancer continuum. I can tell you that when I was part of a couple of the working groups that were involved in treatment and in guidelines back in those days as an industry representative. So I recall, there were a number of working groups created, and all were sort of focused on trying to build this strategy. When it was finally completed, that's when the group went to the government saying, we need some support, and that's how the partnership was created. So as I said, it was initially supported for a 5-year, $250 million commitment that has been renewed, and obviously it's been evolving over the last 5 years. And as they say, all the elements of the cancer continuum are represented in various action groups and initiatives that have been pursued subsequently. So, as Bill said, and I sort of repeated, this strategy renewal is underway. It was announced in October of this year. It was directed by the federal health minister, who's asked CPAC to sort of take a look at whether or not the strategy that was developed back in the mid 2000s is still relevant, and to look at where things should be reoriented. So the CPAC has been engaged in a broad consultation since that time, and they are expected to prepare recommendations for consideration by the federal, provincial, and territorial ministers of health in the spring of 2019. There's a discussion sort of package, if you will, that is guiding the consultation, and the consultations are taking various approaches. There's a survey that's available, and for your information, the deadline for responding to the survey is December the 14th, which is in a couple of weeks. But there are other things going on as well. There's direct outreach that's being conducted by the staff at CPAC, and there'll be other consultation opportunities as the process unfolds. For those of you who sort of want to follow some of the discussion themes, they're listed on the slide in front of you. So with that, I think I will move along and pass it back to Bill. Let me see. Sorry, I was one slide behind here. Just want to make sure I've got everything. Yeah, in addition to providing the survey, you also have the opportunity to send direct input through email. So there's, as I say, a variety of different opportunities to participate. So, Bill.
Excellent, and thanks, Jerry. And we're going to pass it over to Joe in just a second. One thing I'll want to pick up on is that this is not a normal strategy. CPAC's, maybe the cancer control strategy, is actually a 30-year affair, and they've finished their first 10 years, and they had goals stretching out to 2027 and 2037. So It'd just be really interesting to see if the federal government wants to see, okay, well, what can we actually accomplish in the next couple of years as opposed to over the next generation. But maybe we can dig into that and the original 30-year plan. Take us back in time, Joe, and tell us a little bit about how CPAC came into being and the strategy as well.
Okay, thanks, Bill, and good afternoon, everyone. So, as Bill said, I'm a Canadian citizen who hails from New Zealand. So, part of the comments that I've made are associated with coming from a slightly different, governance and public policy environment, and I think that's a key part of how the cancer strategy evolved. As been said, it started off in 1999, and by 2004, it had narrowed down its set of recommendations to the federal government to 94 recommendations. Naturally, the federal government, was able to, I think in some ways, sort of fend off the cancer community and the ask, because it was a large ask of 94 recommendations. And one of the stories that Barb Wiley told, who was at that time the CEO of the cancer community, was that they first presented the plan in, I think, 2001 at a cancer control conference in Ireland, and by 2005, when I got involved with the cancer community, Ireland, New Zealand, Australia, and a few others had taken elements of the Canadian strategy and were implementing it. And as it evolved, up until so the period between 2004 and 2005 was where it was kind of narrowed down into these five strategic goals. And then what happened was, importantly, there was a discussion around the type of governance as to whether the money, if we were successful in getting $50 million, as to whether the money would flow through a government department and grants and contributions process, so $50 million through that sort of process to achieve the same aims and same goals and the same strategies, or whether it should go to a separate not-for-profit outside of government with a board of governors closely associated with the cancer community, with the activity and action focused at the sort of clinical practice level, involvement of patient level, and closer to the research level, and force the cancer community, willingly force, that they were asking for it, to work collaboratively and collectively with existing partners across the sort of five priority areas, rather than have everyone compete for $100,000 to $1 million grants. And then following that, there was underpinning all of the debate around the cancer strategy is kind of two things. One is, how do we do it? So through grants and contributions or alternative not-for-profit. And the second one is, do we need disease-specific strategies in Canada? And shouldn't we look at it from social determinants perspective and other perspectives, and there's overlap? And that's been the ongoing debate, and I think that debate will come up again in this round. But I think for the time, for where Canada was at, and the fact that there was a lack of national goals, and this continues to be a lack of sort of national standards because of the way the federation works around healthcare and goals and targets, and that I think that it was right for its time, and it's part of the discussions will go forward as to how it whether the same model would work in today in 2018, whereas Bill introduced, where I have a knowledge of sort of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and data trusts, and connecting, citizens and volunteers and patients directly to treatment environments. I think those are all the questions that we need to sort of discuss on this call and around the renewal strategy. So I don't know if there's anything else there. Oh, the only other thing I'd just like to say is that when the strategy moved from being an advocacy-driven strategy into and through the platform process and election, and the Conservatives came into power, then it went through the public policy process. And at that time, it hit like a change in government, and it hit a change in from a government that was funding a lot of advocacy-based efforts to a government under Mr. Harper that looked to close down the funding, the direct funding of advocacy-based organizations with federal funds, who were then using those funds to undermine, to advocate against sort of public policy initiatives. And again, that's how that was done, and why that was done, and that is obviously up for debate. But I think that is part and parcel of the context of why perhaps why the patient voice and CCAN and others may not have been at the table as much as what was intended, and there probably needed to be some finessing by the leaders of CPAC as to how to do that, but also please the political masters who are concerned about that issue. And then the final thing is that the aim of the strategy and of CPAC was to decrease the increase in cancer deaths, in mortality and morbidity. In that, for years, the cancer community had gone to Ottawa and said, the size of a small town gets cancer every year, or size of a plane, people die from cancer every day or every week. And politicians had become cognizant, had cognitive dissonance to those sorts of messages. And a key part of the 2005 to 2006 sort of advocacy period was turning that on its head and using a risk management approach and saying, this is how bad it can get if you do nothing. But if you do something, you can reduce the line. So I think when we're looking at the success of CPAC and all the activities and the networks and stakeholders that have been supported through that, one of the things we need to look at have we decreased the increase? I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Joe. That's a great overview of what happened in the beginning. We're going to actually move on. We're still actually tracking Barry down. Hopefully he'll be able to join in and provide some closing comments. But if not, we will look to have a supplementary webinar potentially with Barry and others building on this one. So just a few of the discussion questions that we'll go through will center around 4 general themes. One, what are some of the accomplishments that CPAC has achieved over the past 12 years? What has it done particularly well? Second, where could it improve, or where could it have been more effective? And I think that, Joe, you touched on a couple of those ideas and the tensions very well between, for instance, public health and prevention and socioeconomic issues versus cancer care and treatment in order to actually bend the curve or reduce the speed of increase of the burden of cancer in Canada. We're going to talk about, how can the new strategy be informed on 2 levels. So what are some of the quick wins or low-hanging fruit that a revised strategy could accomplish? And then let's look to the medium and longer term so that the cancer control strategy can be future-proof, because today's patient population, treatments that we have available, and diagnostics and other cancer system initiatives and technologies are changing. We might not be in the same position 5 years from now. So if we're going to do something about a 30-year strategy and make a substantive change, let's really try to future-proof that strategy. And finally, we're going to talk about how CPAC consults and engages stakeholders, including the cancer survivor community, to ensure it's listening and incorporating the input of cancer survivors. And this is where I really have to take my hat off to Jackie and Mona and the whole team at the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network. This is an opportunity for the folks on the line, many of whom are I know, cancer survivors and involved in other organizations. Please get your questions ready and put them forward, because hopefully they can actually help inform the strategy and provide your feedback to CPAC. So why don't I'll throw my first question back to Jerry regarding an acronym that you brought forward, which Joe, which I'll spell out now in case we didn't get it. That's the Canadian Cancer Action Network. And at one point, I think it was called the Canadian Cancer Advocacy Network, and it might have shifted at one point way back when. But Jerry, whither CCAN and what happened to it? What was it, and where is it going, if anywhere?
So CCAN it was an umbrella organization of cancer organizations that were focused on patient advocacy, patient support. It was actually created in 2001, so it predated the formalization of CPAC. And all of the sort of normal suspects were there: Canadian Cancer Society, the various disease-specific cancer advocacy groups, etc. So it was sort of working to meet the needs of that sort of interest in the pre-CPAC period, and then was essentially brought into the process and supported financially by the partnership when the partnership was created. In fact, Jack Shapiro, who was at the time chair of CPAC, was a member of the advisory committee, and Liz Waymond, who was Breast Cancer Canada, I think at the time, was on the board of directors in 2006 when CPAC was established. So CCAN was supported by, but sort of run a little bit separately from CPAC throughout the intervening years until just recently. I gather, and I haven't been able to sort of confirm this, but I gather that there was an expectation when CCAN was brought in and supported financially that it would seek sort of sustainable funding sources to allow it to sort of maintain itself in a self-sustainable way at some point in the process. And I gather that never occurred. So recently, and without any fanfare, the CCAN has dissipated and is no longer part of the formalized structure of CPAC. So I gather that the CPAC is trying to sort of regenerate some kind of a patient voice within that context. And I know that there are patients involved in various initiatives and working groups, but they don't have that sort of same direct connection through CCAN that they had in previous years.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. Just reading up on to prepare for this webinar and watching the strategy evolve, I noticed that there are two named partners for CPAC right now, and that's CAPCA, the Canadian Association of Provincial Cancer Agencies, and the Canadian Cancer Society. So I imagine in previous iterations of this, CCAN would have been there as well, and it's maybe this is an opportunity for a new addition. I should say though, whenever CPAC talks about itself, it mentions that it is the product of grassroots advocacy that happened over many years.
For sure.
And maybe this is not a fair observation, but those are their roots. But how can it show that it continues to live by or be an expression of or live up to those roots in terms of stakeholder advocacy? So maybe I'll throw that question back to Joe, and then we can get into some other questions.
Sorry, that was I apologize. The specific question after the long introduction.
Yeah, it was such a long introduction. So CPAC grew out of stakeholder advocacy over many years.
Yes.
Just building off of what Jerry noticed about CCAN, the Canadian Cancer Action Network, kind of falling off. How can or could CPAC take on that mantle of being an expression of the grassroots advocacy community? Is there any go forward ideas that you might have on that front, Joe?
Well, I think it will very much depend. As you said, that when CCAN was given the funding for a year or so, and then it was meant to be self-sustainable, and I think it was unable to achieve that. The patient voice and that was taken into various individual action groups. It remind as you were talking, actually, I was just reminded that one of the things that came out in 2005, 2006 of some of the work that was done around risk management and reducing costs and looking at the risk was the importance of psychosocial care and the importance of closing some of the sort of the gaps around vulnerable populations with Indigenous populations and things like that. And I found that to be a really exciting part of, and I can even remember the meeting at which this data was presented, because it actually had a direct impact on the budget, in that the budget of psychosocial care up until that point, had a small amount in it. But when people looked at the budget of CPAC and then looked at what was proposed to be spent against impact on costs and morbidity and quality of life, there was there was a change in budgeting, because those areas, those softer areas, so-called, against the sort of the genetics and the treatment and the clinical side that had dominated a lot of the discussion, were actually really important when you were looking at healthcare costs and quality of life. But I think there's depends on where they go, but there's loads of different tools now that CPAC could use to engage directly with citizens, with patients, with patient organizations that didn't exist back in sort of 2005. Through mobile technology and app-based technology that could be incorporated as we move forward. But I think the issue will always come down to is there funding to support a network from within the CPAC or within the donor community, and how collectively does CPAC and does the donor community, the patient voice, work together to mutually serve each other's goals and aims.
Thanks, Joe. And we've got really good news, and probably that's an excellent segue to our third panelist. So maybe I'll turn it over to you, Barry, and we'll go back to the discussion questions in a moment to just introduce yourself and your experience with CPAC, and maybe react to what you've heard and what we've discussed in the run-up to this webinar.
So sure. So I'm Barry Stein. I'm the president of Colorectal Cancer Canada and also of the Coalition Priorité Cancer au Québec. and was involved at the very beginning. And I have to offer a lot of thanks to Joe, who at the time really supported our position for colorectal cancer screening and screening in general to be a priority of CPAC at the very beginning. And I think it's one of the hallmarks of what CPAC has accomplished in terms of working together with us as a patient group. So I want to underscore the importance of the P in CPAC, the partnership, and the future ability of CPAC to partner not only with patient groups but with others in order to achieve its goals faster. But as a consequence of that, we ended up with a national network of colorectal cancer screening programs, and Quebec will be hopefully signing on this year, but certainly we've changed a lot with it. CPAC's also accomplished quite a few other things, apart from some excellent reports which help to establish the status or benchmark where things are in Canada. And I'm just referring to some of the things, for example, in synoptic reporting, which has changed really the paradigm in terms of pathology reporting in Canada and is being extended to other areas in surgery, etc., which has made a huge difference. So I think that there's many very specific things that we could point to, but of course we need a furtherance to this strategy. I think it's paramount that CPAC be an independent body, so not necessarily part of a provincial association of cancer agencies. It really requires the independence so that it can have that ability to be flexible, to be more flexible than it is today, and to partner with patient groups and others to achieve goals. For example, we're working together with CPAC in terms of promotion of clinical trials and clinical trials registries and finders and so forth. This is something that I think could really change the way we have access to drugs and the way drugs are developed in this country and so forth. The discoveries, the research is really fundamental to everything that goes on in terms of cancer in this country. But also we have to be very practical, and I think there's things that are missing which were in the initial objectives. For example, we had once talked about guidelines, and in fact there was a committee on guidelines. And we don't have national guidelines like they have in the United States, the NCCN guidelines, for example, which we have to take account of the provincial jurisdiction, but that doesn't mean that we can't have national guidelines in terms of what the best treatments or what the recommended treatments are, regardless of reimbursement. I think that's important. Those types of things could really change outcomes. And really, at the end of the day, I think that that's what we have to keep a focus on. And maybe that wasn't so clear from the initial mandate. What can we do to improve outcomes for cancer patients in this country? What fundamental shifts should we be making in terms of the way treatment is done, the way we have access to drugs, the new innovations, for example? We're entering into a complete paradigm shift in the types of treatment now. We have to focus on molecular diagnostics. We have to focus on areas which are not necessarily just related to a particular type of cancer. We're going to see huge shifts in this. We saw just yesterday, or the day before, the FDA approved gene fusions. So we're looking for mutations, treating cancer as a series of mutations, perhaps, rather than by disease site. So I think we really have an exciting opportunity in the cancer field to play a leading role, not only in this country, but as an example internationally. And I'll just stop by saying one more thing, and that is that patient groups have evolved, and the level of sophistication of patient groups have evolved to play a role as partners in this, and we're recognized at all international levels and brought into the picture, so that not only is the patient at the center of this treatment, but the patient groups become an active stakeholder partner. I'll just leave it with that, just to get the ball rolling.
And that's a great way to provide your constructive thoughts about where the cancer control strategy can go and how CPAC can evolve to its next level. I'll pick up on one thing that maybe we'll touch on what you work on today, Joe, and that's around data. What does Canada need to do in order to make optimal use of things like cancer registries and patient-reported outcomes and other data points that are being picked up across the country? Is there anything that you're working on right now that could potentially play a role in that effort and that could contribute to the strategy?
No, there is. Through the company that I'm with now, which is Sightline Innovation, was actually Canada's first AI company, incorporated in 2012, which in the AI world is like decades. But the issue that we are sort of most seized of in our public policy sort of leadership role, one of the co-founders is on Minister Bain's digital strategies sort of enterprise table, is the protection and sovereignty of data. And what we mean by that is that for AI to function, to work, to move beyond a math model to a predictive engine, it needs data. So, a computer scientist, mathematician, at MIT can write a good math model, or at Google or Facebook or IBM, but they need data to train that model and develop sort of licensable products. And what we're seeing in our field and in AI is the large data companies, which the large global tech companies, which are essentially data companies, are data harvesting companies. And it's not that they're in the business. I mean, they say they're in the business to cure cancer and find signals in the data, but really what they're in the business is advertising and advertising dollars, and that's where they get their revenues from. So the more data they can get on Canadians, and the more data they can get about patients, the more they can sell that data to pharmaceuticals, to medical supplies, to others in the business to target individual people. So if you think of how the debacle in the UK with Cambridge Analytica unfolded, where Facebook data was taken, profiled, and then used to send targeted messages to citizens in the US around the Trump election, or the UK around Brexit, or in developing nations to change governments, that came through the use of AI. And if you take the same principles, and we know the technology exists, but you then put it in a healthcare setting, you're dealing with, dare I say it, like a wolf in sheep's clothing when you're giving your data away to the large global tech companies. So what we've spent the last 3 or 4 years developing what is called a data trust platform for AI, which allows right through to individual patients, consumers, to control the use of their data, but also for scientists that are part of the data economy to trade their data in a transparent and open way to networks of activity that are trying to find, the sort of health outcomes and health breakthroughs, and not giving their data away for just access to some free software. So for us, it's probably, Canada is one of the richest countries on the planet in terms of data assets, and in healthcare, probably, second to the Scandinavian countries. And in science, we have loads of studies 40, 50 years old, and that's a value to patients, but it's also a value to our economy to help drive innovation and to make sure the data is used for health outcomes and not used to generate advertising dollars.
I think that's an excellent point, and that actually touches on a topic that's very important. First, as to who owns the data, and that sometimes is unclear in this country. But second of all, I was actually just on a panel with a representative from ICES, that is, in Ontario, and we've had some discussions as well with the Bureau d'Innovation in Quebec here. And the question is, you're 100% correct, Joe. There's a tremendous amount of data that's available, but also by the same token, very often inaccessible or accessible, but with lengthy delays. So some of the richest banks of that type of information remain in, for example, in Quebec with the RAMQ, or in Ontario with either OHIP or CCO, for example, and similarly in other provinces. The question is, how do we best gain access to that type of data? I think that's just another role that CPAC could play as a integral part, or a body that could have access and disseminate that type of information throughout the country, particularly for research, and particularly because it also hosts the CCRA. So the Research Alliance could be another opportunity to gain that type of access. But you reached on another point, and just leaving the data side a point aside for a second. The issue of artificial intelligence is extremely important, and I could just tell you that there are so many, as you well know, there's many applications. A recent application would be just in a colonoscopy, how it targets polyps, which may not be seen by the human eye immediately. So there's so many applications, and I think that this would be a fantastic opportunity for CPAC to take an initiative in artificial intelligence in terms of cancer treatment, diagnostics, treatment, and research. So many avenues to look at. And
I think the key there is that, again, it's at the heart of our business model, is that you want organizations like CPAC to have sort of open AI, sort of vendor agnostic platforms as part of their data trust, so that you're encouraging local innovation, but you don't have, one company like Google who controls and has access to all of Canada's data, and actually that limits innovation, that limits scientific discovery. You want to be able to have, and the other key thing of the way we've approached this whole new era of data is we've developed tools and widgets and stuff so the data stays in place. So the data never leaves the domain of the hospital or the doctor or the research scientist who's been collating the data. It never goes it doesn't have to go up into a cloud, into another jurisdiction, and be governed by the Patriot Act.
So Joe and Barry, I just want to jump in briefly. There's a great discussion about the patient level data and the data that will hopefully drive better care for Canadians. I just want to touch briefly on another more macro data point in terms of some of the stats that we've been hearing from the Canadian Cancer Society, that 1 in 2 Canadians alive today are going to get cancer, and 1/4 of Canadians are going to pass away from cancer. And with the growing seniors population, the rapidly aging Canadian demographic, there are going to be a different set of challenges in terms of the prevalence of cancer. Earlier, Joe, you were talking about bending the line or reducing the growth of the increase of prevalence. But I want to turn the question over to Jerry to just talk about the policy challenges that the cancer systems face, given this growing prevalence and any other issues that they have to prepare for in the next iteration of the strategy.
Yeah, I mean, just there's no question. I mean, the data that we have suggests that there's been good progress made in terms of tackling cancer in a sort of a broad sense, in the sense that the absolute numbers keep going up. We've been very successful in managing it better. People aren't dying from it nearly as quickly as they were, and people are living with it for much longer. the survival rates have gone from 25% in the 40s to 60% today, with really dramatic life gains in all areas. So I mean, I think it's important for us to realize that there has been progress made, and I think governments recognize that, but there's no question that this sort of demographic change needs to be taken into account, not really just in cancer, but in healthcare broadly speaking, which is why there's this sort of focus on shifting the way that we manage healthcare, so that we're using resources more efficiently. The focus on real world evidence is occurring sort of under the as a backdrop to all this. So the partnership really has a big job ahead of it in terms of sort of really understanding how these demographic changes are going to impact Canadians, B, how the treatment sort of process and concepts are changing. So as Barry said, there was this former sort of tumor site specific kind of approach to managing cancer, which really has to be turned on its head. So there's we really need to start thinking about how to budget for these growing challenges that are coming forward, and we know it's coming, so we need to sort of just sort of practically examine it and look at it and sort of figure out how we're going to manage better. But so the big issue is that there's a lot of ground to cover, and so I think one of the things that CPAC needs to try and do is to focus its energies, be pretty specific in terms of where it's directing its time and energy, because for them to try and sort of cover the whole ground is going to be a big job, and governments need the insight from the community to sort of figure out what are the places where they can put their best foot forward, and make the most of the new innovations that are sort of coming out, not just in terms of treatment, but also in terms of diagnosis, in terms of prevention, and all these things. So it's a big job, and it's one that CPAC really could, if it had the benefit of the community sort of insights, really sort of bring together into a format that governments can sort of deal with and manage. So I would just encourage people to be vociferous in putting forward your ideas and notions in the context of these consultations that are taking place, and really sort of add your voice to the current consultations.
Yeah, and that brings us back to the first question that actually came in, and there's quite a few questions, and thank you for everyone who's put them forward. We've actually touched on a few of them based on those that input. But one questioner wondered about the implications of this strategy change for the upcoming federal election in 2019, and Jerry, I think that you touched on that opportunity. Yeah. And that's to plan ahead. I mean, a 30-year time horizon for an original strategy. Now, almost halfway through a 30-year strategy, and almost I forget which world or which big economies used to plan 25-year plans. This is really ambitious. We're going to take some of these long-term perspectives. Let's do it right. Let's get the data right. But in 2019, if we can see prevalence going up, innovations coming forward, I think Canadians want to know that the strategy, not just the strategy will be there for them, but cancer care will be for them or the people that they love in a very effective way. And CPAC has a really interesting perspective. One of the other things that came in was a request to remind people that there is this opportunity to provide feedback. And there's a survey that's open right now that actually challenges people to spend $100 in specific areas across the cancer system. There's a Twitter hashtag. There are events that are happening across the country. you can send in an email, and you can also draft a written submission. And just a reminder to folks that those are due by December 14th. I think CPAC would appreciate hearing from many of you on the line, and there might be an opportunity actually to have CPAC out to another webinar like this if the cancer survivor community is amenable to keep this conversation going, because this should not just be a one-time affair today. So, any final thoughts, Barry and Joe, before we thank our listeners and the network?
Just a reminder that of the 40 or so cancer groups that were originally involved in the campaign to control cancer, which helped to lead to the initiative of CPAC. Originally, it was sort of a big strenuous effort at that period of time. The initial goals, I think, from the patient groups' objectives were to improve outcomes. If not eliminate cancer, of course, or prevent cancer, but really to improve outcomes from the disease. And I think we have to keep in mind that while there should be a longer-term strategy, there has to be short-term objectives in order to demonstrate that we can actually have an impact on the disease. Like I said, or like you said, Bill, there's this long-term 30, 40-year strategy, but if you've got 1 year to live, it doesn't help you.
Thanks,
Barry. I think the other thing, just in terms of comments that people are making in when they've had a chance to look at the material, and that is we kind of have to ask ourselves the question, what would have happened? And this is partly what CSCC, the Canadian Strategy of Cancer Control, did ask. What would have happened if we didn't have the money there? And I'm quite sure that it kind of would have got buried in sort of grants and contributions and one-off projects and things like that. So as we look at it, I think that the governance and the way that it's been done through a not-for-profit and the the experts around the table, as opposed to just public officials making decisions, designing programs, is a key thing to hold on to as the strategy goes forward, as the partnership goes forward.
Yeah, I'd fully support that.
Yeah, and I think, Barry, that's what you brought forward too. It's retaining the independent nature of the Canadian. Just to sum up a couple of takeaways from the panelists. And first of all, thank you all for contributing your expertise, and you've been along this journey for longer than many, and there's been people on the call. So let's keep this conversation going. But quickly, takeaways are retain the independent nature of CPAC. Plan for the future, medium term, but also look for some of that low-hanging fruit, because as Barry said, some of the people in the community will not have 30 years ahead of them. And what can they do, or what can the partnership do tomorrow to really make a difference? And maybe third, think about how CPAC can work with patient groups and patient advocacy groups more effectively. Barry, you mentioned that there were 40 back then, and I think a really important takeaway for everyone to hear is that the patient advocacy group network and individual associations have evolved very professional, excellent at the coalface support for patients, and even investing in research and everything. So how can that evolution really be harnessed by CPAC going forward in a way that makes it effective? And I love your question about the counterfactual question, Joe. If not for CPAC, what would have happened? And maybe that's another query for the future. Look at other disease areas that did not have the same kind of attention as cancer. Of course, the Canadian strategy for cardiovascular, there's the CSHAP And I forget, maybe one thing that we should do in Canada is ban all acronyms going forward. That's another strategy. But I like that idea of like a review of if not, then what would have happened to inform going forward. So I probably didn't capture everything because we did touch on a lot. Thank you to all the panelists and for the listeners and people calling in. Take the time to participate in the survey questions, and we're going to bring this feedback back to the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network. Hopefully, that will inform its input into the strategy. So, thanks again, Joe. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Jerry, and we'll see you again at the next webinar.